All right. So the reason why Julius Malema lost the South African elections. We are going to have election coverage live today. We're going to talk to you about what happened in the South African election, why Julius Malema lost, and what is to come. So welcome to This Week in Africa, a collaborative effort between Authentic African and African Stream, where we break down the last week's breaking news and its impact on Pan-Africanism and Africa's independence. Today, we delve into 2024 South African general elections, marking 30 years since the end of apartheid. While democracy endures, the ruling ANC faces criticism for corruption, despite some successes that they have touted in housing and services. So central to the election was a very controversial figure, Julius Malema, whose quote-unquote radical statements, legal issues, and what some call lavish lifestyle have divided opinions. Convicted of hate speech and expelled from the ANC party, Malema's so-called allusions of violence and what they're calling opportunistic behavior sparked debate about his impact in South Africa. So why is he such a force to be reckoned with if there are people in the country who describe him in such ways? Today, we're going to talk about it, and we're going to talk about why he lost the election. Before we do, we'd like to do some introductions so you know who is going to be presenting this information to you today. I will turn it over to my co-host to introduce herself before I introduce myself.
Okay, greetings from Ouagadougou, Burkina Faso, the land of Thomas Sankara and now Ibrahim Traore. My name is Inemesit Richardson, Inem for short. I am a journalist with African Stream. I'm also a member of the All African People's Revolutionary Party, as well as the co-founder of the Thomas Sankara Center for African Liberation and Unity, which is a Pan-African library that I run here in Burkina Faso. Today I have a lovely picture of, actually this side, Modibo Keita, the Pan-African leader of Mali, because it's actually this ancestor's birthday today. So I have that in the background to have his presence with us throughout the show.
Nice. And my name is Joe Hatagwa. I am the founder of a platform called Authentic African, where our goal is to connect the diaspora and Africans living on the continent. I am an American-born Sierra Leonean, traveling back and forth between Sierra Leone and the United States. And my goal is to help people invest, move, and or visit and travel the continent of Africa. So with that, let's get right into today's topic, why you guys are all here, and it's to discuss Julius Malema, right? As you might know, South African elections just happened. And so 28 million voters headed to the polls to choose the new leaders at national and regional levels. The election was dubbed the most competitive and most crucial since the country's first democratic one 30 years ago. The African National Congress, the ANC, convincingly won subsequent elections previously and had dominated the national political landscape ever since. However, according to several opinion polls, that dominance was going to significantly wane. And then, of course, now that the voting has occurred, it has significantly waned. A survey conducted had said that there was a chance that they weren't going to have the same share, and that won out. That was actually true when the time came for folks to go to the polls. So while dozens of parties were to appear on the ballot, the ANC chief competition was actually 3 political parties, 2 of them being ANC offshoots. And so we're going to do a deep dive into that and see what they've gotten to offer. So let's go ahead and jump into a video and give our thoughts on the other side.
Country's growing importance on the global political scene, men will be watching the vote with keen interest. 4 parties are expected to dominate the race. So let's go over these parties and what they stand for. First up is the current ruling party, the African National Congress, or ANC. The ANC came to power in 1994 after a successive decades-long struggle against the apartheid system. Back then, black South Africans had high hopes that the party would change their social and economic fortunes. However, 30 years later, many feel let down. They accuse the ANC of failing to dismantle apartheid-era economic structures that disadvantaged black people. The party has also been mired in many corruption scandals. All this has led to a significant drop in support for the party. An opinion poll by Afrobarometer suggests the ANC will get 39%. It will be the first time since 1994 that it got less than 50%, meaning you have to go to a coalition. Next up is the Democratic Alliance, or DA, which is the country's second largest party. Afrobarometer polling predicts the DA will get just under 20%, down a notch from the 21% share it garnered last time around. The party has struggled to expand its support base beyond its traditional white and mixed race constituencies. Historically, it's opposed reforms that seek to address the legacy of apartheid-era policies that economically excluded black people. These policies, which include the Employment Equity Amendment Act and the Broad-Based Black Economic Empowerment Strategy, aim to help groups that suffered systematic discrimination due to their race during the apartheid era. The DA is also opposed to the expropriation of land without compensation, a policy that aspires to address racially skewed land ownership imbalances. Currently, white people own more than 70% of the land, despite making up less than 10% of the population. The DA's opposition to these policies has alienated it from much of the majority black population. The third horse in the electoral race is the Economic Freedom Fighters, or EFF, led by Julius Malema, a former member of the ANC. Until his expulsion in 2012 for allegedly bringing the party into disrepute, he led the influential ANC Youth League. A year after his expulsion, Malema formed the EFF, a party which describes itself as Marxist, Lenin's Fanonian economic emancipation movement. The party is anchored in policies that seek to transform the country's economy in a fundamental way. It argues that the current economic structures are incapable of improving the lives of black South Africans. The EFF has also adopted a Pan-African position. It believes that Africans across the continent and diaspora need to unite to rid Africa of neocolonialism. According to Afrobarometer, the EFF is likely to get between 10 and 15% of the vote. That's similar to the 10.8% it got in the previous election. The growth of the party has stagnated in recent years. Some have attributed this to its opposition to the growing tide of xenophobia in South Africa. This has pitted it against segments of the population that are against foreigners, especially African migrants. But the party insists it will not depart from its position on the issue. The fourth party to look out for is the newly formed Umkhonto weSizwe, or MK party, which according to Afrobarometer is expected to win at least 10% of the votes. MK is also a splinter from the ANC. The first of the party is Jacob Zuma, a decades-long ANC member who was also the ANC's leader and president of South Africa from 2009 to 2018. Zuma stepped down as president of the nation after intense pressure over alleged corruption. He has repeatedly accused his successor, Cyril Ramaphosa, of orchestrating his removal at the behest of white capitalists. In late 2023, he announced that he would vote for the MK and not the ANC, though still retains his ANC membership. His endorsement of the MK party immediately swelled its support base, especially in his home province of KwaZulu-Natal. Since then, he has led the MK campaign and was on its parliamentary candidates list. However, on 20th May, the country's highest court declared him ineligible to run for parliament due to a 2021 15-month prison sentence for contempt of court. According to the country's constitution, anyone who has been given a prison sentence of 12 months or more without the option of a fine cannot run for office until 5 years after the sentence was completed. It remains to be seen if Zuma's disqualification will negatively affect the MK's numbers at the polls. So, those are the main contenders. Who would you like to see run South Africa?
All right. So before we get into actually how the election went, we thought it was good to just kind of give you all some context for who the parties were and who are at the head of the parties. As you can see, there are many offshoots of the main original party, which, by the way, Nelson Mandela ran the ANC. Or was the head of the ANC when he was president. And so I think it's just important to call that out because that is why it's been such a popular party. It's interesting to see that the two different parties, and I'd love to get your thoughts on this, the DA, which is seemingly opposed to some of the more popular discussions in the country around, giving land back to folks that it was taken from, or even just more specifically, some of the policies that were introduced around, more just making the country more equitable for Black South Africans who, obviously are indigenous to the land. And then you look at the opposite end of the spectrum of that from the EFF party, right, which is led by Julius Malema, who, as they mentioned, was the youth leader for the ANC, and who's looking to not only to operate with those kinds of policies, but then with other policies as well. And so I think it's interesting to see that the EFF hasn't gained ground, or according to those polls, they haven't seemed to gain ground. But and it seems like there are many people within the country that are still xenophobic, which I thought was interesting. So, you know, I think all of that context was helpful. I'd love to get your thoughts on different parties and what you saw from Julius Malema and you know, EFF and versus like the DA and the ANC leading up to this election.
Yeah, I mean, it's like we have so many videos coming that I don't want to spoil so much of like what we're about to watch and some of the other things that we have queued. But you know, I think this who's who sort of presentation of what these different parties are gives a lot of important context to what the stakes are, you know, in this election. Like you've mentioned, we have the ANC, which has ruled over South Africa since the fall of a formal system of apartheid. Of course, the video gives some context into like the land struggles that still exist in South Africa, with this very small white settler majority still controlling the vast majority of the land. So, I mean, that's why I say the formal sort of apartheid structure, but not necessarily an actual end to, you know, the legacy of what that particular form of colonialism and settler colonialism looks like. You know, so I don't know, we see the rise of the DA as a force that has gained a lot more sway in this election as the ANC is also losing power. And, you know, that's, I think, the first thing to look at, even before we get into what's going on with the EFF, though it's related. You know, there's a lot of disillusionment with the ANC. You know, the ANC as a party has, it's been a major political force in South Africa for a long time, well before apartheid was over. Of course, it was, you know, a leading party that brought about the end of the apartheid rule, but it's also gone through very many different shifts politically, you know, and ideologically over the years and over time. And, you know, the ANC that exists right now is largely like, it's like this social democratic party that isn't willing to touch certain like really the fundamental issues within South African society, which is this land question. And that's pretty much failed, honestly, to address since really the negotiations that I don't want to actually use that language, but the negotiations that were done in that the 90s, in the end of this very formal system of apartheid. And so I think we're living with those consequences, you know, our South African people are living with those consequences. And so they have put, for years, for decades now, they've put their trust and their vote in the ANC. And, you know, as a result, they have seen that into the present, there's a huge wealth disparity that continues to exist on racial lines in South Africa, with the indigenous African people not controlling the actual land that belongs to them and their ancestors. And that's the fundamental question, right? Like, I think all of our struggles come down at the end of the day to this question of land. You know, whether we are in a settler colony like South Africa or not, African people are struggling for like resources. We talk about, you know, wanting to control the resources. That's a question of land. And so I think, you know, it's the ANC sort of failure to address this over the years. And African Stream has done other videos that are on the platform that I think also give some context into what has been the result of this ANC rule for these past few decades now, or a couple of decades now. There's a video that was done at, like, I think it's called Poverty in the Land of Nelson Mandela, that shows some of the poorest villages in South Africa and how people are living you know, in really just abject poverty and struggling, despite the fact that there were supposed to be major gains at the end of the fall of this formal apartheid system. And so I just, you know, to not talk too much, of course, you know, the ANC is a positive development relative to the apartheid system that preceded it. But at the same time, that victory was an incomplete one because it didn't address that land question. And that is what the EFF is, you know, that is, I think, that at the core of what the EFF is trying to do, and it's the difference between the EFF and these other parties, as well as their Pan-African position, which we'll talk about in other videos. And then also in the rise of the DA, there's a lot of people who are talking about the DA and are very like shocked and upset that this party, which is, you know, it's a like white power sort of political party, honestly. I mean, if you look at they're very blatant with the language and the rhetoric they use about, you know, South Africa wanting to be considered and positioned as a Western country. You know, there was a video I watched where, you know, these DA representatives were talking about how, and it's on the African Stream page, by the way, talking about how they want to model Cape Town off of certain aspects of Israel, and as a way of kind of protecting. I mean, this was not their exact words, but it was very clear what they're planning, protecting this sort of settler population from these like indigenous masses of people. To put it, you know, very bluntly, there's a lot of like white supremacist rhetoric in their language and in their goals, which it's not just about the language they're using, it's about their actual policy. The fact that they're very clear about keeping the hands of the lands of South Africa in the hands of this minority. But at the same time, I'm not really shocked the way a lot of people are about how successful they are, because this is again a very wealthy and privileged sector of South African society. It's the most economically well-off sector of South African society. So the fact that they'd be able to use their resources to advance within these elections they can't shock me. I think that the flip side of this, and then after this, we'll go to the next video because I'm talking a lot, but I think the other aspect of this to recognize is that this DA group is effective in unifying a lot of the South African settler population under a single banner, whereas the rest of South African society, the masses, remain divided and don't have that unity, that clarity. So even though that indigenous African people are the majority, they are split ideologically, with being influenced and swayed in a lot of different directions. Xenophobia being, unfortunately, a major one that I think we're going to get into with some of these other videos. So I'll stop here for now.
Sure, that's great context. And just to kind of repeat what they said in the video, those 10% own over 70% of the land in the country. Really important to call that number out. And you know, that I think that's eye-opening in and of itself. Okay, so with that, I think what we'll do is we'll head into you know, what actually happened on the day of the election. So results from the 29th of May in South African polls indicate that the country was headed for the first ever coalition government. This follows the failure of the ruling party, the African National Congress, to reach a 50% mark required to form a government. With nearly all the votes counted, the ANC had just slightly over 40% of the vote, followed by the white-led Democratic Alliance with 24% of the vote. So if you guys might remember, Afrobarometer thought that the Democratic Alliance was going to have closer to 20%. So they had closer to 24%. And so in third is the party that's only 6 months old, which is the MK party. And they had actually 14%. So with only 6 months being a party, they jumped past the EFF, finishing at 9.3% of the vote. You know, that was with most of the votes counted. I think the percentages are kind of right in line with that. So those results confirmed that many pre-election polls had predicted the major drop in support for the ANC party, the ruling party, and their possibility of forming a coalition government. So the ANC, however, has remained not really, well, they remain tight-lipped about their potential partners. Like, who are they going to partner with to form this coalition partner? Coalition government. So the MK has, which is led by obviously former ANC and former South African President Jacob Zuma, has ruled out going into the coalition. Has ruled out going into the coalition with the ANC. At least they had previously. The two other main parties, the DA and the EFF, hadn't at the time of this reporting addressed the issue. So with that, the results also point to 2/3 of the country's industrial regions falling under opposition control. The ANC looks to lose a couple of provinces to MK, while the DA is expected to retain the Western Cape, a very influential and affluent community in South Africa. So with that, let's jump into the video that talks a little bit more about it, and then we'll give our thoughts on the other side. So that was disheartening as the results were coming in. And I think you and I, we spoke last Thursday, and it was already looking like people had been giving up. Folks who were EFF party members. Obviously, I think there's no secret that the two of us are we align more with the EFF party and much of what they were looking to do in the country. It feels a lot like what you have in Burkina Faso, what we're seeing with Niger, with Mali, with, kind of separating from the West and really looking to, create their own path. Unfortunately, it seems as though, 9.3% of the vote is what they were able to get. I'd love to just get your thoughts on where we landed after the election. I think it'd be really interesting to to talk about it and get your thoughts.
I mean, we're definitely both disappointed. I feel like, I'm not super surprised. I mean, the video that we watched, the Who's Who video, came out before the election, and they predicted about 10% of the vote. So I think a lot of people kind of anticipated that the EFF that it would turn out this way. One thing I'll say that I didn't mention in the last, when we talked about the Who's Who video, is there's also a lot of people who have talked about sort of an internal ethnic politic within some of these elections, in terms of for example, the new MK party attracting a lot of Zulu supporters, possibly for ethnic reasons. And so I think there are other factors like that are going on. But I also think that, a major thing is, this video the stream that we're on, the live stream we're on, we called this video at one point, "Is Julius Malema a threat to democracy?" And I think that there's an interesting question that's raised here, because it's like Julius Malema is threatening to transform South African society in this very revolutionary and major way. And then we have this sort of electoral system in South Africa that's been very sort of tightly controlled by a specific ANC, not the same super militant ANC that was around at the height of the anti-apartheid struggle, but a very specific ANC that emerges towards the end of the apartheid system. That is the West is very comfortable with it. It's an ANC that's not very threatening. And within this kind of tight control over South African politics, is there room for a possibility of a Malema or an EFF taking power this way? I think that's also a question to be raised. Do they have the space in this sort of type of electoral system where we have these parties that are very well established, very well financed, right? That have a lot of sort of monetary and financial backing.
Sure.
Do they have the space to really just to contest and to win? And then there's, like I said, there's this big ideological piece that we keep mentioning, and then kind of skirting around, because I think it's the thing that underlies this whole conversation around the EFF in the context of South African politics, which again is this question of the xenophobia versus Pan-Africanism. Right. But I think there's also, again, there's an aspect of it that's also I don't know. I think there's still this aspect of how are these sort of xenophobic ideas spreading? I don't know. I think there's some of it is I think we have to follow a bit of a paper trail in terms of who's able to have access to the majority of South African people and shape their opinion. So the EFF did do worse than was predicted. They were supposed to get a little, at least 10+%, and they came out with 9% and then fourth. So yeah, it is a disappointment. But then again, I think it really does make me think about there's a lot of, I'll just say, so as somebody living in the Sahel, we get a lot of finger wagging about like, okay, why are you doing like, why are we supporting coup governments? Why not just have elections? The electoral democratic system is the way to go in terms of bringing about change. And I'm not against it. I'm not against it. I think there's places and contexts where it works very well. But I think maybe there's like a lesson, which is that maybe there's other ways of doing things when we're in a context where things are already kind of rigged against the favor of what's in the interest of the majority of the people. And I think some of the South African elections maybe gives a little bit of food for thought in terms of, what does that mean? I don't think that we're going to see things go in a different way for South Africa for a very, very, very long time. But I do think, the question is worth asking.
Yeah, and I think it's important that, at least you move the Overton window, right? I think, we've seen that in other countries like the United States with talking about the idea of potentially a socialized healthcare, right? 10 years ago in the US, there was never an idea of socialized healthcare. I think, well, there was, but I think in terms of mainstream understanding, something that people thought could happen, and a process for it, right? An actual policy just wasn't there. And so, now you see people saying that is one of the reasons why they would be voting during the primary system, right? During, the Democratic elections, for those of you who are in the West and who understand, U.S. politics. And I think with the EFF, what you're seeing is a Overton window shift, right? Some specific policies, some ideas around ways to help folks that are, indigenous South Africans really see, themselves reflected in government. And, you spoke about the xenophobia. I think one thing that we should talk about is, there are many videos online of South Africans describing and discussing other Africans moving to their country in disparaging ways, right? And I think with Julius Malema, what he, there was a metaphor he had used at one point in time to talk about how it's, Africa is one house, right? And it's just people moving from one room to another room. But there are these other folks who are from outside of the house trying to control who moves into what room and telling us that this isn't one big nation, right? As Africa should be one big nation. And I think that unfortunately, which was surprising to me, is seen as not necessarily the majority of the country's viewpoint. Right, there are many folks within the country who actually disagree with Julius Malema on that point. And to your point, that is, those folks are either DA or in the ANC party, and some potentially are in an MK party as well. And so I thought that was interesting and eye-opening because last year, and we'll get into the next video here, but last year they had done some research online, and I'm, if I'm not mistaken, I can't remember which company did this, but Julius Malema was more searched on the internet. Now, this is globally, who was more searched on the internet than Ramaphosa, right? Who is actually the president of South Africa. And so I think many of us thought that, when the elections came around, Julius Malema would likely be winning and we'd see a much different Africa, right? Maybe more relations with the Sahel region and South Africa and things like that. And unfortunately, that's not what happened. But before we get further into the discussion on Julius Malema, I think what we want to do is maybe give a little bit more context as to who he is. For those of you who are watching and who aren't as familiar with him, I think it's good to kind of give you a little bit of who he is and how he has been portrayed within South Africa and other places around the world. So, as you know, they went to polls. South Africans went to the polls on the 29th, right? There were obviously dozens of political parties that were taking place in the elections. As we mentioned before, it was described as the most critical. Consequently, Julius Malema himself was, for many people internationally, the center of the discussion, right? Much of that had to do with controversies surrounding him, and controversies, and I'll say controversies with air quotes, because a lot of that I think has to do with how people described him that were in the opposition, not necessarily how folks would describe him who support him, obviously. And so basically, the spotlight had been on the political leaders, right? And so Julius Malema, the leader of the EFF, was the one who received the most scathing attacks, especially by Western media outlets. He's been portrayed as unhinged, white-hating, loose cannon, whose policies were quote-unquote going to ruin South Africa. Some has gone as far as referring to him as the Black Hitler. So this is the way he has been described, not only in his country, but outside of South Africa. But those who support the man say he's been badly misrepresented. They say his proposed policies in sectors such as mining, land, and finance are exactly what the country needs to fully break away from its apartheid past. So in this video that we're going to watch now, Africa Stream's William Sakawa goes through the EFF manifesto and highlights the party's views and policies on issues that are of great importance to South Africans and Africans in general. So whether you're a South African or not, I think this could be interesting for you. So we want to jump into the video, and then we will give our thoughts on the other side.
This political party, the economic freedom fighters, is often painted by Western media as an unhinged, white-hating, rabble-rouser. Some have gone as far as referring to him as the African Hitler. But is this really what Malema is about? A dive into the EFF's 2024 election manifesto reveals that the party he leads is arguably one of the most progressive political movements on the continent. It addresses the issues that many South Africans and Africans generally find most important. Chief of this is land, a major grievance in former colonies. London is marred by racial imbalances. White settlers own about 2/3 of the country's arable land, but make up less than 10% of the country's population. When the African National Congress came to power in 1994, it vowed to transfer 30% of arable land to black South Africans by 2014. But after 3 decades in power, less than 10% has been redistributed. The EFF wants to change that fast. Its manifesto pledges to transfer half of the land by the end of its first 5-year term. How? First, by expropriation without compensation. Second, by limiting the amount of land individuals can own. And third, by limiting foreign ownership, especially by multinational corporations and the super rich. And it's not just farmland that's up for redistribution. The EFF plans to repurpose abandoned buildings in urban areas for affordable housing projects in order to address the shortage of accommodation in towns and cities. The second key issue that the EFF's manifesto addresses is the country's unemployment crisis. As of 2023, the official jobless rate stood at nearly 32%. Young people are the hardest hit. Almost half don't have work. So what's the EFF going to do about it? Their manifesto pledges to create jobs through state-led industrialization projects. New state-owned farms dealing with housing and roads will open up 4 million workplaces, and ambitious plans to refine half of South Africa's mineral wealth at home should create millions more. The next big issue that the EFF promises to tackle is decolonizing the African mind. It promises to make education free and to ensure that schools include indigenous forms of knowledge in their curricula. There will also be classes on economic freedom and sovereignty. And in an effort to further the goals of Pan-Africanism and continental cohesion, all South African universities will be required to offer a Swahili language degree. The EFF also has gender inequalities in its sights. Black South African women have historically suffered double oppression. Firstly, for their skin color, and secondly, for their gender. That's why they're even more marginalized than black South African men. To counter this, the EFF says it will make sure that there's 50% female representation in all sectors of the economy. Crime targeting women is also a deep problem in South Africa, with femicide and sexual assault rates among the world's highest. To address this, the EFF says it will establish specialized police units and courts to deal with gender-based crimes. While there is still much opposition to LGBTQ rights across Africa, the EFF champions them. And while same-sex marriages are already legal in South Africa, the community still faces marginalization and even violence. The manifesto commits to ensuring that LGBTQ people are protected and have equal access to public services and opportunities. The EFF's manifesto promises are clearly highly progressive, and contradict the Western media narrative that the party is a gang of bloodthirsty demagogues. Rather, the picture that emerges of their leader Julius Malema is one of a revolutionary who's committed to improving the lives of black South Africans. How many of his fellow countrymen see him that way too, we'll soon find out.
All right, so that's far from the Black Hitler that he has been described as, right? So just a quick recap on some of the things that are part of the manifesto, right? So housing, unemployment, education, free education too. I thought that was really interesting. And also requiring a Swahili language, because obviously most of Eastern Africa speaks Swahili to some degree, Kiswahili. Gender equity or gender equality, and LGBTQ rights. So very much a progressive party, one that you've seen in other parts of the world, but obviously focusing on the idea of Pan-Africanism and other marginalized communities being represented. So as someone who lives in a country who has a leader that the people want, and has a lot of a similar, at least the first two on this list, right? A lot of similar, policies. I'd love to get your thoughts on how you've seen Julius Malema and what you see him, how you would compare him to the Sahel region folks that are in place today.
Yeah, I mean, I'm so disappointed, like I've said multiple times, that he didn't win. I see a lot of people commenting like that they voted EFF, and I think that's I really do think that's the right decision in this context, is to vote EFF, even if we're kind of, like I said, I think in a sort of rigged setup in terms of how South Africa's quote unquote democracy is functioning. I still think, it's the right thing to cast that vote for the EFF, in my opinion. It's sad because you're asking the question of, how do we see compared to maybe like an Ibrahim Traore? I would have loved to see him as the South African head of state actually interacting with Ibrahim Traore and seeing what that looked like. The EFF has staged protests against French neocolonialism in the Sahel in response to some of the uprisings that have happened here over the past couple of years. And so, I know that Malema, as a Pan-Africanist, and the EFF as a whole, not just him as an individual, paid close attention to what's happening in other parts of the continent. And so I think that really would have been such an interesting sort of shift. We don't actually see this on the continent very much anymore, where we have these Pan-African forces that have this level of potential power or power, interacting that closely with each other. This used to be a common thing in the 20th century, where, a Lumumba and a Kwame Nkrumah would collaborate. And then, Zimbabweans were going to get military training in Ghana to fight against, settler colonialism back home. We don't have that kind of across the continent kind of scope to sort of our more, I'd say, state level Pan-African type of successes right now. I think we're much more in a regionalist sort of frame. So I think this really would have had a big and interesting impact that could have broken that. And I really do think that Malema would have tried to build a relationship with Ibrahim Traore, Assimi Goïta, Abdourahmane Tiani of Niger, and that would have been just really interesting to see. I think, in terms of his policies, so, it doesn't surprise me at all that there's a lot of propaganda that is depicting Malema in the worst possible light. I can't be shocked at all that there's a campaign against him that is trying to make him look like he's some sort of buffoon or lunatic. Because, I actually agree with one of the headlines that came up, which is that I think that Malema is dangerous. I think he's dangerous to a neocolonial system. I think he's dangerous to an imperialist system. I think he's dangerous to a system that, globally exploits African people, a system that benefits from keeping South Africa's lands and Africa's lands as a whole in a small minority's hand. I think he's dangerous to that kind of system. So I do think that he is a threat to the South African system. I don't think he's a threat to democracy, because I think that, he represents what's actually in the best interest of the majority of South African people. So I think he would have been the most democratic ruler, in the sense that he would have actually addressed fundamental issues that the majority of the people like actually need these questions of education, of healthcare. I think South Africa just has a really, really major land question that it desperately does need to address in a sort of in a non like in a way that is, I guess, threatening to the system that is in place. That isn't going to necessarily have that sort of ANC approach where it's able to be really cozy and comfortable with like Western countries, while addressing this major contradiction. So I think that I think that this video does a really good job. I really like this video. I think it gives a good primer for people who want to understand, like, why is this EFF party such a big deal? Why is Malema so talked about? I think that there is a big difference. We look at those top 4 political parties. One of them is not like the other.
Absolutely. Well said. And, look, it takes a while sometimes it takes a while to go through the democratic process to have the kind of revolution that we're seeing in the Sahel states. So to your point, it was the will of the people, and it was also in the best interest of the people. It looks like in South Africa, it's the will of a loud minority, but it is the best interest of the country. And unfortunately, that minority hasn't fully become the majority. So now we'd love to get into kind of why the EFF lost, right? I think we've gotten some history on who Malema is and what the EFF is about in their manifesto. We talked a little bit about what the elections look like. What I'd like to now talk about is what happened at the elections and why EFF lost. So obviously the South Africa's economic freedom fighters, the EFF, were pushed into the 4th place in the recent elections, despite having some of the most progressive policies out there. The party had pledged to deliver land reform that would have addressed injustices inherited from the apartheid era. It had also promised to lift Black South Africans out of disproportionate poverty and to nationalize banks and mines. And I think that was really important. One of the things that came up with addressing unemployment, was the fact that you get people to work on refining the minerals that are in the country. One of the biggest challenges on the continent of Africa is that the minerals are mined here, refined elsewhere, and then purchased back here, or I say here, but I mean on the continent of Africa. And I mean, you see diamond, you have like the diamond district and diamond jewelry and all of that being sold in South Africa, but it was mined there, refined somewhere else, and sold back to rich South Africans, right? It's a backwards process, and it just doesn't make any sense. And so the idea was to refine, obviously refine the natural resources in country, nationalize it, so you can ensure that it's being watched over and being handled properly. Unfortunately, though, the party only garnered 9.5% of the vote, with former President Jacob Zuma's MK party actually getting ahead at 15% of the vote. So, according to Timo Media 360, which is the video we're going to watch in a second, the brother in this clip, it comes down to the xenophobia among Black South Africans. For some reason, a large number of Black South Africans reject wider African unity and the EFF's open border policy, quote unquote, with it. Out of the fear that there will be a stampede from across Africa to the country of South Africa. So Malema himself has rejected that explanation, adding that his party is in fact achieved one of its key stated goals, which is ending the ruling ANC's majority. He insists that there will be no change to the Pan-African Party's principles. So with that, let's jump into this video, get a little bit more of an explanation of why the EFF has lost this election.
He didn't even get second, neither did he get third. He got 4th in this particular elections. Now let's face the reality. A lot of blacks in South Africa didn't vote for Julius Malema, and some decided not to vote at all. Now, I am not surprised that Julius Malema lost this particular elections, because if you are familiar with South African politics, this wouldn't be surprised. But what surprises me is the reason why they voted against this young man. Reason number 1, borderless Africa. Are you aware that a lot of blacks in South Africa are against this whole idea of African unity, which is quite surprising? I'm shocked that a lot of people in South Africa believe that if Africa unite, everybody is going to run to South Africa. So basically, some blacks in South Africa believe that other African countries are their main problem.
Yeah, I mean that's a good point, right? I mean the idea, and this you find this in many countries, right? I mean this is not an Africa only problem or South Africa only problem. It's something I've seen in Sierra Leone. It's something I've seen in Ghana. Right? Ghana say this about Nigerians migrating. Sierra Leoneans say this about the Fulani tribe migrating into Sierra Leone. In the United States, they talk about Mexicans migrating and others, right? So the idea of other groups coming in and changing the quote unquote fabric of your country is a real concern for people of these countries. I do think it doesn't necessarily change the fabric of your country. It may actually help, but because I think diversity of thought is important, diversity of cultures is important, and it doesn't change South Africa and who they are, right? The tribes of South Africa remain the tribes of South Africa. They just may have other tribes within the country as well. In any case, I'd love to get your thoughts. I know I just gave my thoughts, but I'd love to get your thoughts on the idea that xenophobia is the reason why the EFF has not garnered more support and did not win this election.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I've been kind of like skirting around this topic of xenophobia this whole time, but now we can finally address it head on. I mean, there's a comment I want to queue up here, like why you guys are so obsessed with a political party that prioritizes mass immigration to dissolve identity of the native people of South Africa. I think it's just such an interesting question to address, and I'm glad that the commenter actually asked the question, because it's like, what is the indigenous identity of South Africa? Like, what does it mean to be a South African? South Africa, has people who have the same ethnic origins of the other countries that border South Africa. There are Swana people on both sides of the border, right? In Botswana and in South Africa. There are Ndebele people who are in Zimbabwe and who are in South Africa. And so, like, at what point do we have like this emergence of something that is a strictly South African identity, where the indigenous population is in this box, and outside of this box, they no longer belong here, even if their, ancestors historically existed on both sides of the border. And that's what we have all across the African continent. South Africa is not an exception to that rule. And I think that there's a lot, I think, of ways that we talk about South Africa incorrectly, especially when we talk about this historical struggle against apartheid, like as a struggle that was led by the South African people within South Africa exclusively, who were able to defeat this apartheid system, when in reality, that's just not how it works. Like, South Africa beat apartheid through Pan-Africanism. I mean, that's just a fact. For one, we see like the entirety of the African continent stood with South Africa. There was a massive liberation struggle. There was a liberation committee that was established by the Organization of African Unity. Dar es Salaam was a base that the ANC used in their struggle against apartheid. So Tanzania played a major role. There's this conversation around how Cuba played a major role in defeating apartheid, like a definitive role in defeating apartheid in South Africa. And Nelson Mandela has like this picture of Fidel Castro thanking him. I don't know if people understand the context of that picture. It wasn't like the Cubans came directly to South Africa, immediately landed in South Africa, and were like, we're going to fight apartheid here. No, they went to Angola. And so how does it happen? How does it happen that, the Cubans go to Angola, help the Angolan Liberation Organization, the MPLA, they help the Angolan freedom struggle, and then that helps lead to the fall of apartheid. Like, how does that connection happen? It's because the MPLA of Angola was fighting against the apartheid system in South Africa, and that was definitive. That really brought apartheid to its knees. So I think that there's this way that we talk about South Africa and talk about the anti-apartheid struggle too much, like this small little box where it's like the Africans of South Africa waged this struggle like independently. When really it was a Pan-African struggle that was brought, to its knees, to, the formal system of apartheid fell because of a large movement that scaled the entirety of the African continent. Even here, like in the Sahel, people and heads of state were protesting, the heads of state were providing material resources, material support to the anti-apartheid struggle. I mean, we're like how many thousands of kilometers away? I'm in Burkina Faso. I'm very far geographically from South Africa. And I'm in a region that lent direct material support. And then in all of those immediate countries surrounding South Africa, there was like actual, like not all of them, the majority, I'll say like a large percentage of the country that surrounded South Africa, there was like actual armed struggle, again, that was largely aimed both against the like local settler populations or the Portuguese settler populations in the context of Angola and Mozambique, but also against the apartheid system of South Africa, meaning there are African people outside of South Africa's borders who fought, some of them died, ultimately to bring up like leading to the end of this formal apartheid system. So I think that there's just like this context of xenophobia, like we need to really open up the conversation around what South Africa's history actually is. But again, I also think that, like I said, I think we need to follow the paper trail a little bit as to why so many people buy into this narrative that, you know, there's this idea of like this closed, fixed indigenous South African identity that like doesn't include other African people who don't have any right to the land, regardless of who drew the border and how that happened. I think we need to kind of interrogate that, because I do think that, like, again, there's like a, you know, the powerful have not just like the powerful, the people who benefit from this kind of narrative have also like the actual financial backing to make sure that that's the dominant thing in the minds of the people who, you know, they're not going to go and look at the fact that they have some of the worst, actually the worst inequality on the planet Earth. I'm pretty sure South Africa ranks #1 in the planet in terms of like internal inequality, not because of immigration, but because of settler colonialism, because of this like racial wealth disparity. But there's just so much effort, like concerted effort into this narrative that instead of looking at the reality, which again, this 10% minority is controlling 70% of the land, it's like, it's much more in the interest of this neo-colonial imperialist system for us to be looking and like wagging fingers at Nigerians and Zimbabweans and Somalis, etc. So I just think that there's a lot to interrogate, and I think that, and I do know, you know, there's a lot of people who've commented like, I could never vote again. And this is not like a study; it's a surveying online reaction, so it's a bit anecdotal. But a lot of people did come out and say online, I'm not supporting the EFF because I don't want to see other Africans coming into South Africa. And so, you know, I think that there is real reason to believe that xenophobia was a major aspect of this election. And it's also unfortunate because it's like, I see so many South Africans also, again, online, who have actually very progressive views on a variety of things. And then it's like, it comes to this conversation around Pan-Africanism versus xenophobia. And all of a sudden it's like the whole progressivism is like, it just shifts. It's like, it's so interesting. Like I've seen literally people give like these wonderful speeches about like, you know, Africans should control Africa's resources, this and that, thinking like, okay, they're actually against this imperialist system. When in reality, they mean that they don't want like exploited, poor working class, like people in their mines who are not from South Africa. Like, what does that have to do with who actually owns these mines? It's not Zimbabweans, you know what I mean? Like, it's not Zimbabweans who own your mines. So who cares if they're, you know, if they're, you know, in the developing or mining within these. It's just, you know, I think there's a lot of, like I said, a lot of effort to get people to think in the wrong direction about what's actually going on within South African politics.
Well put. I mean, lots of great context there. And I like what you said about the artificial borders. I mean, these were drawn about 130 years ago, right? I mean, and they drew borders through tribes, right? So folks talking about South African identity is talking about a Eurocentric identity, right? How the Europeans came and drew borders and determined this is South Africa, right? So, you know, the way people are talking about, and it's interesting to see some of the same terminology I see being spoken about in the United States, right? You have an open borders, right? Texas and California were part of Mexico just less than 150 years ago, right? So, you know, the idea that, you know, things, and even before that, you had a whole bunch of natives there that were just pushed away from their land. So this idea of open borders is an interesting concept that I'm hearing in the comments here, and people talking about artificial borders that were created by the Europeans. And so I definitely think we have to reframe these thought processes, right? And really think about how It's really about the tribes that had land and the Europeans who came in and drew borders. And as you mentioned, split tribes, right? There are tribes in Botswana and in South Africa. That same tribe is on either border. You find the same thing in Ghana and Nigeria and Sierra Leone. It happens everywhere across the continent because these were artificially drawn by people who were carving out their own piece. And they still obviously have, even if they don't rule, they still rule them in the minds of many people on the continent. Okay, so with that being said, I know that we spent a significant amount of time on the South Africa story. And I think what we can do is maybe we could touch on one of the stories from Burkina Faso to kind of close this live out, because again, we want to end on a discussion where we'd like to see Africa go. Right? We've talked about some of the disappointment we saw in South Africa. I think now we can kind of transition over to some stories from around the continent and see a little bit more about where we'd like to see. So now we'll transition into a story from around Africa, specifically to Burkina Faso. And this is a story that Inem actually reported on, right? And so, this is discussing Ibrahim Traore's 5 more years in Burkina Faso. So the people cheered as a charter granted a 5-year extension in office starting on the 2nd of July. His title has changed from the president of the transition of Burkina Faso to the president of Burkina Faso. So on the 25th and the 26th of May, the landlocked country held the national conference where representatives from Burkina Faso's 13 regions convened meetings to determine the country's direction. The process included government officials as well as representatives from civil society organizations and trade unions. So it wasn't just his government, it was many folks that were involved in these decisions. So this extension comes almost 20 months after the military coup that ousted the Western aligned leader. Since then, the population has poured into the streets to express support of the new government, which has taken over areas once held by terrorist groups, kicked out widely unpopular French troops and media, nationalized local industries, and embarked on a pathway to industrialization and job creation with new refineries and plans for new energy facilities. While political parties boycotted this past weekend's, the last weekend's, the previous weekend's decision-making process, party members decided to attend anyway to express their opinions as individuals. Such was the case of ex-leader of the opposition political coalition, who said on local TV news, I told myself that as a patriot, it was my duty to come here. The same was the case for the former president and of a group called the Rally of Patriots for Renewal, who voiced satisfaction with the process. So many ordinary Burkinabe people who spoke outside the conference hall are satisfied with the 5-year extension. However, a visible segment of the population did hope for a 10-year transition period. So with that, let's hop into the video and then we can give our commentary on the other side.
Burkina Faso gathered together to decide on a new time frame for Ibrahim Traore's mandate. At first, rumors broke out that Traore's time in office would be extended by 3 years. But Burkinabe people quickly mobilized to express their disagreement. I spoke with a few on site.
Attendez 10 ou 5 comme ça. Sinon, moins que ça, nous n'en attendons pas ça.
Mais on dirait qu'ils ont choisi ce que les populations ne veulent pas. Donc les gens veulent que ça soit 10 ou 5 ans comme ça. Donc c'est pour cela que les foules attendent de tourner comme ça, qu'ils ne sont pas d'accord.
Et pourquoi est-ce que les populations veulent 10 ans?
Parce que moi, que nos 3 ans, ne serait-ce que Ibrahim Traoré ne peut pas faire ces projets. C'est trop court.
Voilà, mais je vois d'autres qui disent qu'eux veulent 3 ans ou 5 ans comme ça. Mais nous, peuple burkinabé, on n'est pas prêt pour ça. Ce que nous voulons prononcer ça jusqu'à 10 ans et renouvelable. Parce que Les années passées, on avait eu des présidents, mais un président comme celui-là, on n'a pas encore eu depuis la mort de Thomas Sankara.
In the end, the decision was changed to grant Traoré 5 more years and to change his title from President of the Transition of Burkina Faso to President of Burkina Faso.
Ce qui est intéressant dedans aussi, 5 ans, il peut être dans sa tenue. Et puis, voilà, il n'est plus le président de la transition et puis il peut présenter à l'élection.
C'est le deuxième Sankara qui est là. Depuis l'indépendance, on n'a eu que 2 présidents au Burkina Faso. C'est Thomas Sankara et puis Ibrahim Traoré. Le reste là-bas, moi je ne le connais pas.
Nice, well done. So, you know, since you were there, you spoke to the people. I know you couldn't get everyone's, you know, the video would have been too long to get everyone's opinions, right? But you've gotten the general sentiment on the ground. Again, obviously, most people are in alignment with this. In fact, they want more time. And so, love to get your thoughts on what those days were like last month, a little over a week ago, and what do you think it means for Burkina Faso moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, this was like, it's surreal sometimes to be in Burkina Faso, and I think this is one of those moments. You know, I'm a citizen of 2 countries, the United States and Nigeria. So I've never been in a position to like be in a country before people love the leader. That's not the experience that I've had. I've never been in a position where it's like we have to defend the government. It's always, you know, we have to struggle against the government. And so it's so, like I said, it's just surreal to be here. And it was amazing to be at that protest and to just see like people crying out, wanting more and more of Ibrahim Traoré's leadership and time. And that's what it's like really regularly here. Like, okay, I understand that, you know, I'm going around to a protest that people are generally in favor of Ibrahim Traoré in this kind of setting. I'm asking people in a specific place, you know, how do they feel? But honestly, I can say like 100% honestly, if I were to just go around my neighborhood, I live in a regular working class neighborhood in Ouagadougou. If I were to just go around my neighborhood with a microphone and interview people and ask them, you know, what do you think of Ibrahim Traoré? I really expect like every single person to have something positive to say about the leadership in Burkina Faso. That doesn't mean 100% of the country, but I'm saying in like a regular residential area in Ouagadougou that represents the average person, I would actually expect like pretty close to like almost 100% of people, honestly, around me being like, yeah, Ibrahim Traoré is the best leader that we've had since Thomas Sankara. And so, you know, I think it's so interesting to like watch this video and kind of contrast that with what we just saw out of South Africa. And just like, it's 2 very different systems and like processes. So like this doesn't look like the typical democratic process that most people are used to seeing, where you go and, you know, cast the vote in the ballot box, and then, you know, there's a bunch of different parties competing, and then that's not what happened in Burkina Faso. And so a lot of people think it's like shocking, like, you know, how can we accept this kind of a system? But at the same time, you know, every single policy decision that has like every single major policy decision that has like come to fruition in Burkina Faso since Ibrahim Traoré took power has been something that first emerged from like the grassroots sectors of society, people crying out and saying like, you know, we want to get rid of the French military. And then he does it. You know, we don't want to collaborate with France. We'd prefer to collaborate with like countries that are not part of NATO. Then he does it. You know, we want to have a very close relationship with neighboring Mali and Niger, and then he does it. And so it's like every single thing that like the people call for, he responds to. And so like I think it's very similar even with this meeting. It's like there was this question of like, okay, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years. People were saying, like the majority of people were saying, you know, we prefer for 10 years, we want at least 5. And in the end, the decision did come out to be 5. And so I think it, again, is really out of respect for what the majority of people want in the system that they want. I also like, I think this is, again, just this whole conversation around Ibrahim Traoré and the AES and the Sahel, just as, like I said, like it fits really nice into this conversation with South Africa to just look at different ways of like contrasting sort of where people are at, what people want, and how people get it. There's this comment here that says, If you really care about opening borders, why is there no one speaking of opening borders in Djibouti or elsewhere in Africa? I love this question because I feel like, I live in a country with open borders for African people. Ibrahim Traore has said, even though Burkina Faso is leaving ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African States, he said, and this is a quote from him, "We remain Pan-Africanist. Any African who shows up here is welcome." And for all intents and purposes, as far as I know, I have never heard of any African with any passport being rejected, denied, or deported from Burkina Faso. And there have been now increasingly more delegations coming out also from the diaspora, and not exclusively, because I know, there's policies like the year of the return and stuff like that, which is about only getting honestly, like a specific class of people from the diaspora to come. That's not what I mean. I know people who are from many different African countries. I think officially, like the ECOWAS, like some of the rules are like you would get, I think, 3 months in a country visa free is like typical on an ECOWAS passport. I would say it's not enforced in Burkina Faso. Like, I'm not even afraid to say it. Like, I'm here on a Nigerian passport. I'm not leaving and exiting the country every 3 months. You can stay as long as you want. There's Togo, Benin, Nigeria, Cote d'Ivoire. We don't deport people here. It really is. And I know people who are not from ECOWAS countries also, and they have African passport, an example, and will continue to be even more of an example as we move forward and develop like more and more sort of policy kind of outlining what this Pan-African sense looks like. But I think Burkina Faso is a great example of this question of like, what does it mean for an African country to actually have open borders for African people? Ibrahim Traore is a really beloved leader, and like I said, it's really cool to get to actually really support the president of the country that you live in.
Well said. Great context. Yeah, and that open borders, I think, has such a negative connotation, and I think if we can reframe that on the continent, that is what Pan-Africanism is about, right? Is that we're all working together to develop the continent of Africa. So, we spent a significant amount of time on the South African elections. There are people still commenting on it. There are a lot of opinions and thoughts on it. I think it was a healthy discussion, some healthy debating happening in the comments. Obviously we did not get the outcome we were looking for, but we'll see what happens with the coalition government if EFF ends up becoming a part of that. So we'll keep you guys all posted on that. As we know more, you will know more, as well as continuing to follow the story in Burkina Faso and the other Sahel states, and just all of what's happening on the continent of Africa weekly. You can expect us to be here generally on Mondays, but we will, every once in a while, there may be a day or so change. But generally, we're here on Mondays at 3 p.m. GMT generally, and so we will continue to be here weekly to give you the stories of the week. Before we close this thing out, do you have any last thoughts or comments, Inem, before we go?
I'll just give another shout out again to Modibo Keita, our revolutionary ancestor from Mali, who's having his birthday today. I know he's not as well known in English-speaking countries, but he's a really big deal in the Sahel. So we admire him a lot in Burkina Faso. So maybe I just leave you with that. You can look into his life and legacy.
Nice. And all of you who haven't already, make sure you subscribe to both channels, Authentic African and African Stream. Follow us on all platforms. We're on Twitter, X, Facebook, YouTube, and Instagram. You'll find us all there. You know what the logos look like. You know where to find us. And so with that, thanks for watching. We will see you all next week.